In the suffocating summer of 1856, deep in rural Texas, there existed an event slave owners simply called the race. It was no competition. It was scheduled massacre, bloody entertainment for wealthy men bored with lives of luxury built upon the suffering of others. Once a year, during 3 nights of the new moon, planters from across the South converged on Blackwater Plantation with pockets full of gold and souls empty of humanity. Simple and brutal was the rule. At 9:00 at night, 10 enslaved men were released into the swamp. At 9:15, the hunters set out after them. White men on horseback, armed with rifles and accompanied by packs of dogs trained to tear human flesh. The betting began weeks in advance. How long would the fastest one survive? How many bodies would be recovered by morning? Which master owned the most resilient slave? No one had ever survived the Blackwater race. In 7 years of existence, 70 black men had been thrown into that swampy hell. 70 men had died, shot, drowned, torn apart by dogs, or simply swallowed by the mud and the night. Their bodies fed the alligators. Their names were forgotten before dawn. And the next morning, while house slaves cleaned the blood from the master's boots, life on the plantations continued as if nothing had happened. But in the 8th year, something changed. Among the 10 men chained in the yard of Blackwater Plantation that June night, there was one the other slaves called simply Abel. His back carried the scars of 200 lashes. His eyes had witnessed the sale of his wife and children to distant plantations. His hands knew only work and pain, but his mind had been busy for months, plotting something no slave owner could imagine. While the white men drank imported whiskey and counted stacks of gold coins by lantern light, while they adjusted their weapons and fed their dogs raw meat to awaken their hunger, Abel looked at the other 9 men beside him. And they all looked back because they all knew this night would be different. This night, the hunters would become the hunted. Before we continue with this shocking story, tell me, which city are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Let's continue. Sprawling across 3,000 acres of East Texas wilderness was the Blackwater Plantation, where pine forests gave way to cypress swamps, and the land itself seemed to hold secrets in its dark waters. From his father, Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the property, along with 147 human beings he considered livestock. But the colonel had grown tired of cotton and tobacco. He craved something more stimulating than profit margins and harvest reports. That's when he conceived the race. In 1849, the first year, it had been almost accidental. A drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters about whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp. By the 2nd year, word had spread across the South. From as far as Charleston and New Orleans arrived wealthy men, bringing their finest horses, their deadliest weapons, and their most disposable property. In the shadowy world of the plantation elite, the event became legend. Whispered about in gentlemen's clubs, discussed over cigars and brandy, but never mentioned in polite society or in the presence of northern abolitionists. Perfect for the purpose was the swamp itself, 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, quicksand pits, and predators, both reptilian and insect. A man could disappear there and never be found. Many had. But while Colonel Whitmore thought he controlled every aspect of his twisted game, he had made one critical miscalculation. He believed the men he sent into that swamp were broken, defeated, too terrified, and exhausted to think beyond their own survival. He never imagined they could plan. He never considered they might communicate. He never dreamed they could organize. And he certainly never suspected that his own house slaves, the ones he trusted to serve his meals and shine his boots, were part of the conspiracy. to Blackwater Plantation for $800 had Abel been sold 3 months before the 8th annual race. He arrived in chains, his body emaciated from weeks on the auction circuit, his spirit supposedly crushed by the loss of his family. Colonel Whitmore considered it a bargain, a prime field hand at nearly half the going rate of $500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Significantly, Abel's reputation as a troublemaker had lowered his value. Twice before at his previous plantation in Louisiana, he had attempted escape. Both times he had been caught and punished with 100 lashes each time, the scars crisscrossing his back like a brutal map of resistance and defiance. What the colonel didn't know was that during those failed escape attempts, Abel had learned something. He had learned patience. He had learned to watch, to listen, to gather information while appearing defeated and broken. And most importantly, he had learned that freedom achieved alone was no freedom at all. Not when it meant leaving brothers and sisters behind in bondage. Not when it meant your own liberation was built on the continued suffering of others who had helped you, sheltered you, kept your secrets. On his 3rd day at Blackwater, while working in the cotton fields under the brutal June sun that turned the air thick as honey, Abel heard 2 overseers discussing the race. Casually they spoke, laughing about the previous year's event, about how the betting pool had reached 20 Zalosen in gold coin and banknotes, about how one man had made it almost a mile before the dogs caught him and tore open his legs, about how another had tried to hide underwater in a cypress hollow and drowned when he stayed under too long. Tremendously amusing they found it all, slapping their thighs and wiping tears of laughter from their eyes. They mentioned that Colonel Whitmore himself had won $4,000 on a bet that no slave would survive past midnight, proving once again that the colonel knew his property better than anyone. Nothing said Abel. He kept his head down, his hands moving steadily through the cotton bolls, filling his sack with the white fiber that built Southern fortunes. But his mind was racing, calculating, remembering every word. That evening in the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins behind the main house, where the enslaved population lived in conditions barely fit for animals. Abel sat quietly, while the other men and women ate their meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork. Carefully measured were the portions to provide just enough nutrition to keep them working, but never enough to satisfy the constant, gnawing hunger. He listened to their conversations, learning names, relationships, hierarchies, the invisible social structure that existed beneath the surface of plantation life. There was Samuel, a massive man who worked as the plantation blacksmith, worth at least $2,000 because of his specialized skills in metalwork and repair. There was Moses, quick and clever, who tended the colonel's horses, including a thoroughbred stallion valued at $3,300 that had been shipped from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, who had been at Blackwater longer than anyone else. 15 years of unbroken servitude that had left him gaunt but observant, his value diminished to perhaps $500 due to age and visible exhaustion. There was Caleb, young and strong at 22 years old, purchased just months earlier from a plantation in Alabama for $100,200, his youth and strength making him valuable for the hardest field work. There was Ruth, one of the house slaves, who cleaned the colonel's study and overheard conversations the white men thought were private. At $100,000 was her value set despite her ability to read and write, skills she kept carefully hidden because literacy in a slave was considered dangerous. Carefully, Abel watched them all. Little he said during those first weeks, establishing himself as quiet and compliant, never drawing attention to himself. Hard he worked, never complained, never met the eyes of white men directly, performed every task with mechanical efficiency. Around him, the overseers began to relax. convinced that the whippings at his previous plantation had finally broken whatever defiant spirit he once possessed. As closely they stopped watching him, as frequently they stopped checking on him. And that was exactly what Abel wanted. A kind of freedom was invisibility. The freedom to observe without being observed, to plan without being suspected. It was Ruth who approached him first. On a moonless night 2 weeks after his arrival, she came to his cabin, moving silently through the darkness like a ghost. On his rough straw mattress, Abel had been lying, staring at the ceiling through gaps in the wooden planks, when her shadow appeared in his doorway. Barely 10 feet square was the cabin, with walls that didn't quite meet the roof and a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. 6 men slept there, packed together. But that night, Abel was alone because the others were working a night shift in the sugar house. "You planning something?" she whispered. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Still, Abel remained, unsure if this was a trap. Sometimes, house slaves reported to the master in exchange for small privileges. An extra piece of meat, a warmer blanket, a day without work. The masters called them good slaves and rewarded their betrayals, while the other enslaved people called them something else entirely. His thoughts Ruth seemed to read. "I ain't no informer," she said. "I've been here 6 years. I seen 3 races. I seen 30 men go into that swamp. 30 men who never came back. One of them was my brother. His name was Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs got him in the first hour. I heard him screaming from the main house, where I was serving brandy to the men who bet on how long he'd last." Slowly, Abel sat up in the faint starlight coming through the gaps in the cabin walls. Clearly now he could see her face, the hatred burning in her eyes like hot coals, the same hatred he carried in his own chest like a permanent weight. "I heard the overseers talking about you," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "Said you tried to run twice before at the merchant plantation in Louisiana. Said you took 100 lashes each time and didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't break. Said you're either the bravest fool they ever seen or the most dangerous. I think you're dangerous, and I think you're planning something for the race." For a long moment, Abel studied her, weighing the risk. Then once slowly he nodded, committing himself to trust because without trust, there could be no plan, no resistance, no chance. Quickly, Ruth said, as if she'd been waiting months to share this information, "The colonel keeps his guns in a cabinet in his study. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all loaded and ready. The key hangs on a hook behind his desk, right next to the portrait of his father. Every night after dinner, he drinks a bottle of bourbon, sometimes 2 if he's had a good day. By 10:00, he can barely walk straight. The overseers play cards in the barn until midnight, drinking corn whiskey and betting pocket money. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but only one handler sleeps nearby in a small room attached to the kennel, and he's deaf in his left ear from a hunting accident 5 years ago." In his chest, Abel felt something stir, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dangerous, treacherous hope that could get you killed if you believed in it too much. But also the only thing that made survival worthwhile. "How many others know?" he asked quietly. "Samuel knows. Moses knows. Isaiah been talking about it for years. But he never had nobody willing to lead. Nobody crazy enough to try. There's others, too. People who work in the house, people who move around the property. Maybe 10, 12 people total who would help if they thought there was a real chance. We've been waiting for someone like you." Over the following weeks, carefully through the plantation Abel moved, making contact with each person Ruth had mentioned. In small groups they met, never more than 3 at a time, always in different locations to avoid establishing a pattern that might be noticed. In the blacksmith shop, where the ring of hammer on anvil covered their whispered conversations. In the tobacco drying barn, where the thick leaves absorbed sound and created shadowy spaces. In the cistern behind the kitchen, where the splash of water being drawn masked their voices. Brief, purposeful, focused on gathering information and building trust was each meeting. Essential to their plan became Samuel the blacksmith. A thoughtful man he was despite his size, someone who had spent years working with metal and fire, understanding how things could be shaped and transformed. He began setting aside pieces of scrap iron, shaping them secretly into crude but effective weapons. A blade attached to a wooden handle that could pierce flesh, a spike that could be driven through bone, lengths of chain that could strangle or be used to bind. Slowly, carefully he worked, never taking so much material that it would be noticed, never working on the weapons when anyone was watching. Over 8 weeks, he accumulated enough weapons for 10 men, hiding them in 3 separate locations around the property, buried in oilcloth to prevent rust, placed where they could be retrieved quickly when needed. With an expert eye, Moses studied the horses and the layout of the property. Since childhood, he had been working with animals and understood their behavior, their fears, their instincts. He reported that the colonel owned 8 horses, all kept in the main stable near the house. More than any 3 slaves combined was the thoroughbred stallion worth. And jealously the colonel guarded it, checking on it personally every evening. But often the other horses were left unsupervised after dark, their stable doors closed but not locked. The assumption being that no slave would dare try to steal a horse, because the punishment was death by hanging. Also, Moses mapped the swamp entrances, identifying which paths led to quicksand and which were relatively safe. Information gathered over years of retrieving game birds the white men had shot during hunting expeditions. He knew where the water was shallow enough to wade through and where it dropped suddenly to depths of 8 or 10 feet. He knew which cypress trees had roots you could stand on and which concealed sinkholes that would swallow a man whole. Despite his age and exhaustion, despite the way his hands shook from years of brutal labor, Isaiah proved to have the sharpest memory of anyone Abel had ever met. Every detail of the previous 7 races he recounted, describing the exact timing, the positions of the hunters, the routes the fleeing men had taken. He remembered that the hunters always split into 3 groups, 1 circling left around the swamp's perimeter, 1 circling right, 1 driving straight through the middle in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side of the swamp, where the ground was firmest and allowed them to build up speed. He remembered that the colonel himself never entered the swamp, instead watching from a raised platform near the starting point. A wooden structure about 8 feet high that gave him a clear view of the initial chase. From that platform, he collected bets from latecomers and distributed winnings to those who had guessed correctly about survival times and death methods. Last year's race had drawn 17 plantation owners with a betting pool of 23,000 in gold and banknotes, the largest sum yet assembled for the event. In the main house, Ruth continued to serve, listening to every conversation, reading every letter left carelessly on the colonel's desk, observing the rhythms and routines of the white family and their guests. She learned that for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon, was this year's race scheduled, when darkness would be complete and the hunting would be most challenging. She learned that to planters across 5 states, invitations had been sent, each one hand-delivered by trusted servants. She learned that to his peers the colonel had bragged about acquiring fresh stock, including a troublemaker from Louisiana who was sure to provide exciting sport. A clear reference to Abel himself, she learned that to $500 per night, the entry fee for hunters had been raised, with all proceeds going into the prize pool, making this year's event potentially the most lucrative yet. The largest yet the Colonel expected this year's race to be, perhaps drawing 30 participants and a betting pool exceeding 40,000. But most importantly, Ruth learned something the Colonel had mentioned, casually over dinner one evening. Something he considered insignificant, but which changed everything about Abel's planning. For the first time this year, the Colonel planned to allow the selected slaves to spend the afternoon before the race unchained, to let them build up hope before crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological torture would make the event more entertaining, that men who spent hours contemplating possible escape routes would run harder, fight more desperately, provide better sport for the paying audience. The idea had come from one of his guests the previous year, a plantation owner from Mississippi who claimed to have extensive experience in managing slave psychology for optimal performance. When Ruth reported this to Abel, for the first time since arriving at Blackwater, he smiled. It was not a pleasant smile, not the smile of happiness or joy, but the smile of a man who had just been handed the key to his enemy's destruction. "That's when we move," he said quietly. Slowly over the following weeks the plan took shape, refined through dozens of whispered conversations, tested against every possible contingency they could imagine. Not during the race itself would they try to escape, which is what everyone expected, what every slave before them had attempted. Not blindly into the swamp would they run, where terrain and trained hunters gave all advantage to the white men. Instead, they would turn the event inside out, transform the hunters into the hunted, use the chaos and darkness to their advantage, and strike back with a violence that would echo across the South for generations. But more than weapons and timing they needed people willing to die if necessary, willing to fight against impossible odds, willing to sacrifice individual survival for collective revenge. They needed men who had reached the point where death held no terror, because life had become indistinguishable from death, where the only remaining choice was between dying like an animal or dying like a warrior. Personally, Abel approached each candidate, usually late at night, always in private. First was Caleb. Selected for the race had been the young man from Alabama, chosen because of his youth and strength, qualities the Colonel believed would make for exciting sport, a man who would run fast and far before being brought down. When in complete detail Abel told him the plan, holding nothing back, Caleb's eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked almost like hunger. "You talking about killing white men?" Caleb whispered, the words barely forming on his lips. "They'll hunt us forever. They'll kill everyone on this plantation. They'll make an example that'll be remembered for 100 years. They're going to kill us anyway." Abel replied calmly, stating it as simple fact. "You've been selected for the race. You understand what that means. You got maybe one chance in 100 of seeing sunrise, and that's if you're lucky. Most men don't last 2 hours. The record is 3 hours and 40 minutes. Set 3 years ago by a man named Joshua, who made it almost to the western edge before the dogs cornered him against a ravine. They say he fought the dogs with his bare hands for 15 minutes before a hunter shot him in the head. That's the best anyone has ever done. 3 hours and 40 minutes of terror before dying. Is that the death you want?" For a long moment Caleb was silent, his hands trembling slightly. Then slowly he nodded. I'd rather die fighting than die running. I'd rather take some of them with me than just be their sport. Similar resolve Abel found in the others. There was Thomas, a field hand who had watched his wife sold away 3 years earlier. Her price of 900 yuan used to pay the colonel's gambling debts after a bad night of cards in New Orleans. Thomas had tried to buy her freedom, had begged the colonel to sell him instead, had offered to work double shifts for the rest of his life. The colonel had laughed in his face and sold the woman to a brothel in Mobile. There was Benjamin, who bore scars on his arms from a punishment that had involved holding hot coals for speaking back to an overseer. A torture that had left his hands permanently damaged, reducing his value but not his hatred. There was Elijah, whose son had been beaten to death at age 12 for stealing an apple from the colonel's orchard. His small body valued at nothing in the plantation ledgers, his murder recorded simply as disposed of damaged property, with no further explanation or consequence. There was Marcus, who had been separated from his mother at age 8 and sold at auction in Charleston for 400. Who could still remember her screaming his name as he was loaded onto a wagon. There was Joseph, purchased just a year ago for 4,000 zalazand after his previous owner went bankrupt, who had been a house slave at a relatively comfortable plantation before being sold to the brutal conditions of Blackwater. A story written in scars and loss had each man. The point where death held no more terror than life had each man reached. Ready was each man. By late May, 10 men committed to the plan they had. Weapons hidden in 3 separate locations around the property they had. Detailed knowledge of the swamp, the timing of patrols, the habits of the overseers they had. Ruth and 3 other house slaves ready to help from inside the main house they had. To drug food if needed, to unlock doors, to create distractions. Moses ready to handle the horses, to scatter them at the critical moment they had. Samuel ready to break the locks on the ammunition storage, if the opportunity presented itself they had. Any guarantee the plan would work was what they didn't have. Too many variables there were, too many things that could go wrong. All of them to torture and execution would doom a single betrayal. Everything could unravel a single mistake, one moment of hesitation or panic. Razor thin was the margin between success and catastrophic failure. At night Abel lay awake, reviewing every detail, searching for weaknesses, playing out scenarios in his mind. Like a physical thing pressed on him, the weight of responsibility, like carrying another person on his back. With their lives were trusting him these men, their families, the other slaves on the plantation. Everyone was at risk. If he failed, if the plan collapsed, in blood and screaming would be measured the repercussions. For decades would be talked about examples the colonel would make. Public torture and execution designed to crush any thought of resistance anywhere in the South. But if he succeeded, if they actually pulled this off, far beyond Blackwater plantation would echo a blow they would strike. They would prove that enslaved people could fight back, could organize, could defeat their oppressors, despite overwhelming odds. From plantation to plantation, they would create a story that would spread, whispered in fields and cabins, sung in coded spirituals, carrying a message of resistance and hope to thousands of people who lived without either. On June 1st, his official selections for the race Colonel Whitmore made. In the main yard he gathered all the male slaves, walking among them like a man choosing livestock at market, examining muscles and teeth, asking questions about stamina and speed. 10 men he selected, calling out their names one by one with casual authority: Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 others who were not part of the conspiracy, who knew nothing about the plan. Simon, David, and Jacob. Like a stone in water, Abel's heart sank. 3 men who knew nothing. 3 men who would panic when the plan unfolded. 3 men who could ruin everything through ignorance or fear or simple bad luck. That evening he approached them separately, taking an enormous risk. Simon was 35, a quiet man who had been at Blackwater for 8 years, who kept to himself and rarely spoke. David was 42, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident in the lumber mill where a saw had caught his hand, an injury that had reduced his value by 300. Jacob was barely 19, newly purchased for $100 from a plantation in Mississippi, still raw from being torn away from his mother just weeks earlier. Everything Abel told them. The entire plan he laid out, the weapons, the timing, the coordinated attack, the risks. He explained that 2 choices they had: join the conspiracy and have a chance at freedom and revenge, or run blindly into the swamp and die like the 70 men before them. Their deaths entertainment for wealthy men who would forget their names before breakfast. Carefully Simon listened, his face revealing nothing. Then a single question he asked in a voice steady as iron. "You really think we can kill them all?" "No." Abel answered honestly, because lies would help no one now. "I think some of us will die. Maybe most of us, maybe all of us. But I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running like an animal while they place bets on how long I last." For a moment Simon thought, weighing possibilities. Then his hand he extended. "I'm in. Been waiting 8 years for a chance like this." Harder to convince was David. Older, more cautious he was, worn down by years of brutality that had taught him the futility of resistance. "Even if we kill everyone here," he said slowly, "they'll send the army. They'll send bounty hunters. They'll track us to Mexico if they have to. They'll make it a national cause. Proof that slaves can't be trusted. Justification for even worse treatment everywhere." "Maybe," Abel agreed. "Probably. But at least we'll die as men, not as property. At least we'll make them pay a price. At least somewhere some other slaves will hear about what we did and know it's possible." At his mutilated hand David stared. The 2 missing fingers a permanent reminder of how little white men cared about black bodies, how easily they discarded and damaged human beings in pursuit of profit. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'm in. Got nothing left to lose anyway." The biggest risk was Jacob. Young, scared he was, still harboring illusions that compliance might earn mercy, that being a good slave might result in decent treatment. But angry he was also, still raw from being torn from his mother and sold like cattle. On that anger Abel gambled, on the freshness of his wounds. "They paid $100 for you," Abel told him quietly. "You know what that means. You're expensive property, valuable prime stock. But the moment you step into that swamp, you stop being valuable. You become entertainment. They're going to shoot you for fun like you're a deer or a rabbit. Your mother sold you, thinking at least you'd live. At least you'd survive, even if she never saw you again. You want to prove her wrong. You want to die for their amusement 3 weeks after she said goodbye." Down Jacob's face tears rolled, but set was his jaw. "What do I have to do?" he asked. 13 they were. 10 who had planned for months, and 3 who had been forced to adapt instantly. Ideal it wasn't, but enough it would have to be, in agonizing slowness past the final 2 weeks. Endlessly stretching out each day, the plantation buzzed with preparation for the race. Daily carriages began arriving, bringing wealthy men from across the South. With servants they came, with hunting dogs on leashes, with expensive rifles in leather cases. The guest quarters in the main house they filled and overflowed into tents erected on the lawn, creating a temporary village of wealth and privilege. Constantly hung over the property the smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke. At night, From the main house windows spilled lantern light as the guests drank and gambled and told stories about previous hunts, about slaves they had killed, about the entertainment value of human suffering. The names she overheard while serving drinks: Ruth, reported Richard Dumont from New Orleans, a sugar plantation owner worth over 200,000, who owned 3 plantations and over 400 slaves. Henry Caldwell from Alabama, who owned 4 plantations and nearly 600 slaves, who had built his fortune on cotton and cruelty in equal measure. William Preston from Georgia, who had won $3,000 at last year's race by correctly betting that one slave would survive past midnight, but not see dawn. Thomas Ashford from Mississippi, who had brought 12 dogs and was offering side bets of 100 per dog on which animal would draw first blood. Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, who owned a slave trading company and had personally auctioned over 15,000 human beings in his career, separating families and selling children with the casual efficiency of a man selling livestock. Not poor men struggling to survive were these. Not desperate men driven by need were these. The wealthiest, most powerful members of Southern society were these. Men who shaped laws and controlled governments. Men who sat in state legislatures and congressional seats. Men who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization, while organizing hunts of human beings for entertainment. No contradiction they saw in attending church on Sunday and betting on how long a man could survive being hunted on Saturday. Larger than any previous year grew the betting pool. By June 14th, a 52,000 in gold coins, banknotes, and promissory notes from banks across the South it had reached. In leather bags on a special table, in the main house the colonel displayed it, arranged like trophies for all the guests to admire. The 52,000, more money than any slave would see in 10 lifetimes of labor, more money than most white men would earn in 20 years of work. All of it wagered on human suffering. Particularly excited this year were the guests. The slaves working in the main house reported. Of fresh blood and new sport they spoke. Strategy for the hunt they discussed, debated the best positions, compared weapons. The dogs they fed raw meat and let go hungry for 2 days before the race, to sharpen their hunger and aggression, to make them more vicious when released. On the morning of June 15th, from the other slaves were separated the selected 13 and taken to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. As promised, unchained they were kept, though from a raised platform 4 armed overseers watched them constantly. Extra food they were given, cornbread and actual meat, a mockery of kindness designed to give them energy for running. Good sport the white men wanted. They didn't want their prey to collapse from exhaustion before the entertainment began. The time Abel used to review the plan one final time with the others, speaking in voices too low for the overseers to hear. In a corner of the pen they huddled, their bodies blocking the view, their words carried away by the afternoon breeze. Near the eastern edge Samuel would be positioned, where 3 iron blades, wrapped in oilcloth, he had hidden. For the western side Moses would head, near where the horses were tied to a rail fence. Together in the center Thomas and Benjamin would stay, where crude spears fashioned from sharpened wood were buried under leaves and mud. In a loose formation the others would spread out, each man knowing his role, each man ready to adapt if things went wrong, which almost certainly they would. 30 minutes after they were released would come the critical moment when, with confidence high and guard down, the hunters entered the swamp. Not running away in panic would the slaves be. Circling back they would be, using paths they had studied for months, positioning themselves for ambush, turning from prey into predators. They think we're animals, Abel told the others quietly. They think we're going to run in panic. Make mistakes, die easy. That's what they've seen for 7 years. That's what they expect. So we give them the opposite. We move slow and careful. We move quiet. We use everything we know about this swamp, and they know nothing. And when they come into our territory, when they're spread out and overconfident, we take them apart one by one. As darkness fell across Blackwater Plantation, near the starting point assembled the guests. Dozens of lanterns illuminated the scene, casting long, dancing shadows across the lawn. At their leashes strained the dogs, snarling and snapping at the air. With practiced efficiency, the hunters checked their weapons, loading rifles and pistols, adjusting sights, preparing for the hunt. On his raised platform stood the colonel, addressing the crowd with whiskey-soaked pride, his voice booming across the assembled wealth. "Gentlemen," he called out, spreading his arms wide, "welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. This year we have 13 fine specimens for your entertainment. At a 52,000 stands the betting pool, the largest in our history. As always, bets may be placed on survival time, distance traveled, or manner of death. At 900 sharp will be released the prey. At 90:15 begins the hunt. May the best hunter win, and may we all enjoy a profitable evening." Enthusiastically cheered the crowd. Hands changed money as last-minute wagers were made. 500 someone bet that no slave would make it past the first creek. 300 someone else bet that the dogs would kill at least 3 men before the hunters fired a shot. Festive celebratory was the atmosphere, like a county fair or holiday gathering. To the starting line were led the 13 men by overseers with whips and rifles. Back at the assembled white men, Abel looked. At their confident faces, at their expensive clothing, at the weapons glinting in the lantern light. Every detail he memorized. These were the faces of people who considered themselves superior, who believed they had a God-given right to own and destroy human beings, who built their entire civilization on the principle that some lives had value and others did not. In a few hours, Abel thought, some of those faces would be gone forever. High above his head, the colonel raised a pistol. Silent fell the crowd, anticipation thick in the air. Then into the sky he fired, the shot echoing across the property. Begun had the race. Into the darkness sprinted the 13 men, their feet splashing through shallow water at the swamp's edge. Behind them roared the crowd with excitement. Encouragement to their favorite hunter, shouted someone. Desperately howled the dogs, straining to be released. But for exactly 15 minutes, a head start would the slaves have. Time to establish distance. Time to disappear into the labyrinth of water and trees. Deeper into the swamp led Abel the group, but not at full speed. Running all out would exhaust them within minutes, and leave them gasping for breath when silent they needed to be. Energy they needed to preserve, and together stay. In previous years, in panic had scattered the slaves, each man trying to save himself, that individualism dooming them all to isolation and death. 200 yards. Abel called back to the others, his voice low but clear. Then we split. Remember the markers. Remember the plan. Weeks they had spent learning this terrain, mapping every feature in their minds. Left towards solid ground meant that lightning struck cypress. Safety for 50 feet meant that cluster of rocks. Quicksand, that could swallow a man in minutes, meant that patch of glowing moss. Their only real advantage against horses and guns and trained dogs was knowledge. At exactly 9:15, the second gunshot they heard. Coming were the hunters. Dogs baying they heard, men shouting to each other, the splash of horses entering the water. "Now," Abel hissed. Into 4 units split the group as planned. With him Abel took Simon, Jacob, and Caleb, circling toward the eastern edge where weapon Samuel had hidden. West moved Thomas and Benjamin, with David heading for the wooden spears. North headed Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah toward the deepest part of the swamp, where horses couldn't follow, where over a man's head was the water, and cypress roots created a maze no one could navigate without intimate knowledge. Their route, their destination, their timing knew each group. For everyone to circle back toward the starting point from different directions was the plan, creating confusion, making the hunters think they were chasing fleeing prey, when in reality into carefully prepared killing zones they were walking. Quickly through water that came up to their thighs moved Abel's group, cold and black and smelling of decay. Behind them they could hear the hunters shouting coordinates to each other, the dogs baying with bloodlust. But in the wrong direction were moving the sounds. The obvious trail were following the hunters, the one that led deeper into the swamp in a straight line. They think we're running straight like everyone before us, Caleb whispered, following instinct instead of strategy. Good, Abel replied quietly. Let them think we're animals. The lightning struck cypress they reached and found Samuel's cache exactly where supposed to be. 3 pieces of iron filed into crude blades, each about 8 inches long, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. One Abel took, feeling the weight in his hand, the rough metal grip Samuel had fashioned. To Caleb and Jacob he gave the others. A heavy branch thick as a man's arm picked up Simon that would serve as an effective club. Remember what we planned, Abel said quietly. All of them, crouching in the shadows with water lapping at their chests. We don't attack unless we're sure we can win. We pick off stragglers and isolated hunters. We avoid groups. We use the darkness and their own confusion against them. Low in the water they crouched, only their heads above the surface, and waited with the patience of men who had spent their entire lives waiting, who understood that patience was sometimes the only power the powerless possessed. 3 minutes later appeared the first hunter, moving alone through the darkness. Young he was, maybe 25, wearing expensive riding clothes, now soaked and muddy. A rifle he carried that probably cost more than Abel's sale price. A beautiful weapon with silver inlay and a polished stock. Carelessly he moved, thrashing through the water, making noise, convinced of his own safety, certain that ahead of him were the prey, fleeing in terror, and not behind him, waiting in ambush. Like a ghost made flesh never saw he Abel rise from the water. Between the ribs and angled upward toward the heart went the iron blade into his back. To scream tried the man, but Abel's other hand covered his mouth, muffling the sound. Underwater they pulled him, holding him down as he struggled, as weaker became his movements, as the life left his body, and just another piece of the swamp he became. Into the mud sank his expensive rifle, lost forever. One, Abel whispered, feeling not joy but grim satisfaction. This was justice, crude and brutal, but justice nonetheless. On they moved carefully, following the edge of the swamp back toward the starting point. In the distance they heard gunshots, then shouting that sounded confused, almost panicked. Something had discovered the hunters. Probably one of the decoy trails the slaves had prepared. More confusion, more chaos. Perfect. Older, experienced was the second hunter they found, moving more carefully than the first. A pistol in one hand he had, and a lantern in the other. A tactical error that destroyed his night vision, while advertising his position to anyone watching. Pass him Abel let, staying low in the water. Then behind him silently rose Simon and brought the heavy branch down on the back of his skull with devastating force. Instantly dropped the man. His pistol and lantern they took, valuable prizes. 2. Caleb counted quietly. From different parts of the swamp came sounds of violence. A dog yelping, the sound cut short by something brutal. In alarm, men shouting, their voices high with fear. A gunshot, then another, Then silence. Engaging the hunters were the other groups, picking them off, disrupting the hunt. The western edge of the swamp reached Abel's group and found Moses waiting with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 dead hunters and 2 dead dogs, their bodies partially submerged in dark water. A pistol he'd taken from one of the bodies held Moses. "The horses?" Abel asked quietly. "Scattered them like we planned." Moses replied with grim satisfaction. Cut through the tethers, fired a shot in the air. They panicked and ran in all directions. Some of the white men went chasing after them on foot. Away from the swamp. Pure chaos. Better than Abel had dared to hope this was. More chaos, more confusion, more hunters separated and vulnerable. "How many total have we killed?" Thomas asked. "At least 7, maybe more," Moses said. "But they're starting to realize something's wrong." I heard them trying to regroup near the center, calling for each other. Then while they're grouped, we hit them. Abel decided. All of us together. One fast attack. Then we scatter before they can organize a real defense. Through the darkness they moved toward the sounds of men calling to each other. Voices filled with confusion and rising fear. Indeed had gathered the hunters in a clearing, perhaps 15 of them, lanterns raised high, guns pointed at shadows. Afraid now they were, the realization dawning that something had gone terribly wrong with their entertainment. The predators had become prey, and in their bones they knew it. Quietly around them circled Abel's group, joined by Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah emerging from the north like vengeful spirits. 13 slaves armed with stolen guns, crude blades, clubs, and stones. 13 men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. From 4 directions, simultaneously they attacked. A coordinated assault born of desperation and rage and months of planning. Deafening was the gunfire, echoing across the swamp. Men screamed. Lanterns shattered, plunging sections of the clearing into darkness. In the chaos and confusion, at each other as often as at the slaves shot the hunters. The young man from South Carolina Abel saw. Jonathan Reed, the slave trader who had sold 15 Zallos and human beings, trying to reload his rifle with trembling hands. His throat opened Abel's blade. With one stroke ended 15 Zallos and lives. Perhaps 4 minutes lasted the fight, an eternity compressed into moments of pure violence. When over it was, dead or dying lay 12 more hunters. Into the darkness fled the remaining few, their courage evaporated, running in blind panic like the prey they had come to hunt. Quickly took stock Abel. They had lost Benjamin, shot through the chest in the initial exchange of gunfire. They had lost David, his skull crushed by a rifle butt. 11 men remained standing, 11 survivors out of 13. "Back to the plantation," Abel ordered, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system, "before they can regroup and organize a real defense." Quickly through the swamp they moved, following paths they knew by heart, every route and stone familiar. Behind them, scattered gunfire they could hear, men shooting at shadows, fear consuming what remained of the hunting party. When from the swamp they emerged, covered in mud and blood, in complete disarray they found the plantation. Their belongings in panic were gathering the guests who hadn't entered the swamp, preparing to flee. Frantically ran servants. Dogs barked. By trembling hands were being hastily saddled the horses that hadn't been scattered. On his raised platform stood the colonel, trying to organize a defense, his face purple with rage and alcohol and dawning terror. "What are you doing?" he screamed at his guests, his voice breaking.
"They're slaves! Just slaves! We have guns! We have numbers!"
"We can." Never finished he the sentence. From 30 feet away shot him Moses with steady hands. Backward off the platform fell the colonel, landing in the dirt with his skull shattered, His blood soaking into the ground, he had walked on like a king. Not a battle was what followed. An execution it was, brutal and swift and merciless. Surprise, desperation, intimate knowledge of the property, and the support of over 100 other enslaved people who now saw their chance for freedom had the slaves. Panic, confusion, greed that made them prioritize saving their valuables over defending themselves, and the fatal arrogance of people who had never truly believed the enslaved could fight back had the white men. Fight tried some, run tried some, hide in buildings and root cellars tried some. Succeeded none. Joined in Ruth and the other house slaves, using knives from the kitchen, heavy candlesticks, iron pokers from the fireplace, whatever they could find. In the colonel study opened Samuel the weapons cabinet, distributing rifles to anyone who could shoot. Saw their opportunity and rose up did the plantation slaves, previously uninvolved in the conspiracy. 147 people, enslaved, and brutalized for years, turned on their oppressors with a fury that had been building across generations. By midnight, finished it was. 34 white men lay dead, the guests from Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, all the wealthy plantation owners who had come for entertainment, the colonel and his overseers, the handlers and supervisors. All of them ended. Burning was the main house, flames climbing into the night sky like a beacon, consuming the grand architecture built with slave labor. Burning were the stables. Burning was the cotton storehouse. Into hellish daylight turned the darkness, smoke and fire, visible for miles. In the colonel's study before the flames consumed it, the leather bags containing 52 $, they found. For a long moment stared Abel at the money, all that gold and paper representing bets on human suffering. Then one bag he picked up and hurled into the growing fire. "We're not thieves," he said firmly. "We're not property anymore. We're free people. And free people don't take blood money." Without hesitation followed his example the others, the 52 $, the price of blood, sport, and human degradation, burning to ash and smoke. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, in the yard gathered the survivors. Of the original 13 selected for the race, 11 remained alive. Of the other plantation slaves, all but a handful had survived the uprising. 143 people, no longer property, no longer slaves, standing together as the sun rose on a new day. What supplies they could carry they took: weapons, food, blankets, tools, anything useful for the journey ahead. All the remaining animals they freed except the horses, which in shifts they would ride. Then, in small groups they left, moving in different directions, initially to confuse pursuit, all ultimately heading toward Mexico and freedom, leaving behind nothing but smoke and ruins and a story that would spread across the South like wildfire. Never happened again the Blackwater race. By the state was eventually seized the property and auctioned off, but no one wanted it. The legend of what happened there, of slaves rising up and slaughtering their masters, made it cursed ground. From the swamp on moonless nights, claimed local people to hear screams coming. For years sat empty the building, until finally from neglect it collapsed, and in the slave quarters across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond, in whispers, spoke people about Abel, and the night the hunters became the hunted, about the race that ended with fire and blood and freedom. With each telling grew the story, becoming both symbol and inspiration, a reminder that oppression could be resisted, that the oppressed could fight back, that even the most powerful could fall. To Mexico reached Abel and his companions 7 weeks later, after fighting through pursuit by bounty hunters and militia. To build new lives south of the border survived most. After the Civil War returned some years later to search for families torn apart by slavery. Into history disappeared some, their fates unknown, their names forgotten, but their actions remembered, but lived on the story. And every plantation owner who heard it felt a tremor of fear, wondering if their own slaves were planning something similar, wondering if they too might one day face the vengeance they had spent lifetimes earning. 34 white men killed the Blackwater Massacre and 143 black souls freed. Exceeded 300 Zalzers the financial loss, including property, crops, and human assets. But incalculable was the psychological impact. A crack in the foundation of slavery itself, proof that by those it sought to crush could be broken the system. And somewhere in Mexico, a quiet life built a bell, never forgetting the night he transformed from prey to predator. Never forgetting the men and women who fought beside him. Never forgetting that freedom is not given, but taken, paid for in blood and fire, and absolute refusal to accept bondage as fate.